Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University.
Welcome to the Politics Guys, a political analysis show where we take you deeper into the week's biggest stories. I'm Trey Orndorff, and this week I'm with Michael Baranowski. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing just fine, Trey. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. It's great to be back. It's been a few weeks since I've been on this show, and I've kind of missed it, but it was nice as I'm finishing up my semester.
Yeah, it's always a nice feeling to be done with the grading for the semester. I know it well.
Yeah, and so now we can kind of focus in on some of the big issues, the things that none of my students wanted to talk about, which is policy.
Absolutely.
Well, this week, Michael, I think one of the biggest things that our listeners are going to be interested in is the Alabama election is in the books. It's done. Doug Jones is the winner. And there's some really interesting things for those of us who are interested in the data coming out of the data. And so I wanted to point out a few things and get your thoughts on this. One fascinating facet here is that Jones, and this isn't a big shock to anybody who follows politics, but he had near unanimous support from black voters at 96%. As a matter of fact, at a larger rate than Barack Obama did when he ran, which is fascinating. The other thing that's really interesting is that we saw that college education, although it broke for Jones, college education was not the primary variable determining who was going to vote between Jones and Moore. As a matter of fact, it was white and religion that had far more of a correlation than did education, which is a little bit fascinating. As a matter of fact, white born again Christians voted for Moore at an 80% rate. So what do you think about some of these numbers, and why do you think it might be the case that college education was not maybe the variable one would have considered, especially given that the key issue was theoretically sexual harassment?
Well, I think, first of all, I guess that I understand the excitement of my fellow liberals at this result, at this surprising result. But I think that we have a tendency to make too much of it. I mean, Alabama is a deep red state, and so those who are sort of arguing that this is, the precursor to some sort of a wave, this is some sort of a model for how Democrats can retake the South again, or some such nonsense. I think it's nonsense, because if you actually take a look, dig into those numbers, to me, the one number that sort of stood out the most is despite Moore being a horribly flawed, just about designed in a Democratic lab to be the worst possible candidate, or the best candidate to run against, right? You still had an incredibly close race that, if there hadn't been these write-in candidates, that Moore probably would have squeaked through and won despite all this. And so, to me, in a sense, this is not terrifically surprising. This is Alabama we're talking about. And so the education results, the race results, none of that really surprised me, given what we know about how tribal people are in their party affiliations. And so, for me, certainly the sexual misconduct thing was the big thing. But if you listen to what a lot of Moore supporters were saying, and a lot of Alabama conservatives were saying, is a lot of them just didn't believe any of those stories. And to me, that's the point we've gotten to, is that now we're at a stage where if there's news that looks, that reflects badly on your candidate, you can choose to simply disregard it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an option that wasn't available to people 10, 20 years ago. It's awfully convenient, I got to say.
Well, let's put some of the numbers in there. I mean, so you were talking about the write-ins, Michael, and they accounted for 1.7% of the vote. Roy Moore gets 48.4% of the vote, meaning that if he gets all of the write-ins, which I think is what a lot of people are assuming, right, that puts him over the top, and you're absolutely right. This is a fascinating case. And, and I'm glad that you bring up the celebration on the left, because, I am not, I'm not a leftist.
No, you're not.
But if I was on the Democratic Party, I almost kind of feel like I would have wanted Roy Moore to win. And let me explain why, because I mean, so you celebrate this now, but as a guy who has caucused with Republicans for a long time, Moore losing makes me say, whew, because Moore in a midterm election, when he wins, is a giant target, a beautiful target to win in districts where you're not normally going to win. Moore, the guy who ran and lost, you can't run against him anymore because he lost. And
Right.
so it's a little bit fascinating because in some ways, if I was being the Democratic strategist, I would almost want Moore to win. Isn't Moore the crazy victory better for me in the long run than
Yeah.
Moore losing the seat that I know I'm not going to win again in a few years?
Yeah, I both agree and I'm disgusted by that. And I think you're disgusted by it too, in a way. Was
Yes,
that
I mean yes,
what?
yes.
Well, I mean, what I mean is from a standpoint of common decency, from a standpoint of sanity. Roy
And
Moore does not
morality. Let's just
belong.
say
Yeah,
morality because I think it's continue.
yeah. Roy Moore does not belong in the United States Senate, and so in this sense, this was a victory for decency and reason and all of those good things that we like so much, whether we're on the left or the right. And so in that sense, but yes, you're right that it's certainly a much better campaign issue. But the problem being, of course, is that both parties now so often think in terms of that as opposed to what's the right thing to do now, as opposed to how can we set ourselves up for the future better. And that's what our politics has devolved into so often, and that's the part I'm disgusted by.
Well, and I agree with you, Michael. And as kind of a coda on this, it's because I've done this at the end of every semester for a number of years. I have students, they have to do what I call the super secret in-person final. And what it really is, they have to come in and they basically go through an election model where they're going to distribute 2.5% of their final grade to the class. But it's a kind of an interesting situation because if they can't come to a way of distributing the points, which is not enough so everybody can get an A, everybody will get a D. But it is possible to get more than that if they were to distribute it just completely equally. But they don't want to distribute equally. They want to do it based on performance or other metrics, and that's fine. That's what they're allowed to do. And it stresses them out to no end. And so then when we get done and I come out, and I always tell them, I said, look, the purpose of this at the end of the semester is you guys were stressing about this more than anything we've ever talked about in this class. And it's 2.5% of one class in one semester of your college
Yeah,
career.
nothing.
How about the guy you're voting for? I mean, you're voting for somebody for 6 years who's going to determine your tax policy. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And you don't stress about that as much as you do the 2.5%. So let's think about that. And I think one of the things that I kind of highlighted behind the numbers on the Alabama race is this unfortunate tendency now that we see, especially in the social media age, where everything has to be, we don't talk policy anymore as voters, hard stop period.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, on
And
that
that's,
note, what do you think?
yeah. Yeah, well, one final thing I want to point out is that we know that the race is over. Doug Jones knows it's over. President Trump, who actually had a nice congratulatory message to Doug Jones on Twitter in a very un-Trumpian fashion, knows it's over. Even Steve Bannon knows it's over. But one person who doesn't know it's over yet is Roy Moore, who as of yet, at least as of the time we're taping this, has refused to concede the election, which is, I guess, vintage Roy Moore. But if Steve Bannon is telling you to give up, I think it's time to give up, Roy Moore.
I think Moore is just waiting for a divine symbol. I think he's waiting for a heavenly recount, and when that comes in, is when he's gonna.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, and the sad thing is, on a more serious note, before we move on, is that's the sort of thing, that sort of view is the kind of thing that allows people who are sort of hostile to religion to say, see, this is what religious people are like. They're nuts. They're crazy. And that's really unfortunate, I think, because Roy Moore is not symbolic, I don't think, or is not representative of what the mainstream religious, somewhat conservative people are, and yet a lot of people get branded because he's the guy who's has the big microphone and is up there, and that's just too bad.
it is unfortunate, and it's good of you to point that out.
All right, now I know we have a net neutrality discussion here that we want to get into, but before we do that, I was hoping we could take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's show.
Please do.
Okay, and that is Dollar Shave Club. Now, everyone's heard Jay and me talk about the amazing shave that we get from our Dollar Shave Club razors, especially when we use it with their Dr. Carver shave butter. And the good news is now they have even more products for your daily routine. I mean, they've got stuff for your hair, your face, your skin, your shower, even butt wipes. I mean, so head to toe, everything you need. And it's all their own original stuff with premium ingredients that's delivered right to your door, just like the razors. So you don't have to deal with those annoying trips to the store. And no one likes annoying trips to the store. That's why they're called, annoying trips to the store. Anyway, we want you to love Dollar Shave Club as much as we do. So we've arranged for you to try your first month of their best razor, along with travel-size versions of shave butter, body cleanser, and even those butt wipes for just $5. And after that, replacement cartridges ship for just a few bucks a month. It's the Dollar Shave Club starter set. Get yours for just $5 exclusively at dollarshaveclub.com/TPG. That's dollarshaveclub.com/TPG.
Well, I think it's time to talk a little about net neutrality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, this is interesting, Michael, because I know that this is a point where, I've been listening to you and Jay talk. This is a point where we are in more agreement than Jay and I are in agreement, despite ideological positionings in general. And so this week, net neutrality has ended. It has formally ended. So you guys have taken a look and talked a lot about what might happen. I know there was a lot of talk on social media about that show and what you guys were thinking. And it's interesting because what I want to start off with is, oftentimes we don't do kind of in-depth reporting or anything, but I actually have a source on this one.
Ooh, okay.
So because of his position at he works with telecom. I can't say that. I'm not going to say the telecom's company's name, and I won't say his name. But it was interesting because I've been asking him, what's the deal with this, because they manage a ton of the traffic that goes across the United States. And it's interesting because what has happened is there has actually been some memos that have come through at this telecom company saying, look, people, we aren't going to change anything for the next year. Because they don't want anything to happen quickly. He said, nothing is going to change now. But that the big but here is that he doesn't envision. He thinks that others are in the same kind of position. Although this is one of the bigger ones, that there will be no change in the year and a half, maybe even 2-year range, because they don't want there to seem to be a connection between this vote and any kinds of data changes. However, the but meaning is that all of these memos going around, they're explicit. We're not having any changes now because we can't have another black eye. Not, we can't have any changes right now because we don't want changes. We want to see where this all pans out. What happens with these other issues in Congress? They're waiting for this to kind of all simmer down before we're going to see, I think, what will be the kinds of more permanent changes here in a year or 2 years down the line.
Yeah. Well, it's not surprising when the head of the FCC was formerly a top attorney for Verizon. I mean, this is the kind of policy you're going to get, and I think everyone saw this
on the
coming.
Daily Caller?
I did not. What did he have to? Was he doing an interview?
He basically tried to do this funny thing, kind of lambasting that there could be any change with net neutrality. It was weird. Like, I can't even. Listeners, I can't summarize to you. It's so a non sequitur and bizarre. It was an attempt to be funny, but I just found it crazy.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, I think where you and I and Jay all agree on this issue is that competition is a good thing, and it results in more choices and lower prices for consumers. We all agree on that,
Mm-hmm.
But if you take a look at some of Pi's positions and I think the FCC's positions in the last, since the Trump presidency, they're not so much pro competition, they're pro telecom, and that's a very different thing. I mean, lifting media ownership limits, easing various caps on what broadband providers can charge, cutting back, or it's not cutting back, but eliminating the proposal about allowing set-top boxes to be more easily used and increasing competition. There's just a string of things that say, what can we do for the telecom companies? And I think that's sort of their approach, as opposed to what can we do to promote a competitive market in internet services, and that's what we really want. And I think that's what that's what they don't see. And I'm not suggesting that he's a bad guy and has nefarious motives, but I think when you spend a lot of your time looking at the world from the perspective of Verizon, you're necessarily going to adopt that sort of viewpoint and not be able to see those sort of things. And so I think this is a huge mistake, and for reasons that Jay and I have talked about. But fundamentally, I think it's an anti-competitive mood, and it's going to actually make it harder to compete and innovate. And for Republicans, especially, and conservatives who say, this is what we're all about, I say, well, this kind of goes against what you're all about, I think.
No, I agree, and I think one of all of those things that you're saying are true, and I don't want to make it sound like I disagree on that front. But the thing that is the single most worrisome for me is the treatment of packets across networks and
Yeah.
the ability to now prioritize and compartmentalize those packets as they travel in different locations across state borders, non-state borders, and borders, and single it out as different kinds of data levels, streams, packaging deals. I think that is actually the singular worst aspect
Yeah.
of this is all. I mean, again, set top boxes. Again, I'm with you, but that I don't think that will fundamentally reshape the way we
Sure. Yeah.
communicate, the way this packet business goes down. And I know that on both sides, there's lots of arguments about, well, look, they own these spaces, but it's very difficult to overestimate how important again, take this term, I'm not talking about net neutrality itself, but just packet neutrality is to your day-to-day life. The ability
Yeah.
so that your message goes through at the same potential rate that somebody's Netflix packet goes through, that our podcast goes through. And when you think about the outcomes of changing that, and I know that around on the internet, there are all these things talking about cable TV. Yeah, I mean, that could happen. What's more likely to happen is something probably more nefarious because it would be not as visible to you. You just don't receive those packets in the same kind of time. And so you think that you're making a free market move to go from one
Hmm.
service to another. But what you're really doing is you're going from what you perceive to be a broken service because those packets
Yeah.
are not coming at equal rates. And
Yeah.
for the guys on the left, I really wish that they would stop with this, hey, listen, we're going to have packages for your internet. No, you're not going to be buying YouTube, but you might end up getting pushed to YouTube versus another service because they paid for a high stream data connection,
Right.
and you don't know it.
Hmm.
That is what's scary, um, from my point of view, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. So one positive note we can say before we move on is that this won't go into effect probably right away, given all the lawsuits. And even though there was a vote, there are all kinds of lawsuits that are already in the works. And my hope, at least, is that this is tied up in court for a number of years, up until the point where maybe even we get a little change on the FCC. Of course, that wouldn't happen until after 2020 and a very different presidential election. But that's another thing I'm sort of hoping for out
Yeah.
there in the future. So that we might differ a little bit on that, certainly, because I think most Republicans who are likely to be president in 2020 and beyond might actually be on the current FCC side on this. But you differ, and I think you differ for all the right reasons that are in line with what I believe are solid, conservative, free market, pro competition principles. And I'm with you on that.
Well, see, for once, we're not going to have any argument. There you go, listeners.
Nope.
So, well, let's move on to the GOP tax plan. Last time when we were taking a look at this, or Michael and Jay were taking a look at this had just headed to conference committee. And just as a reminder, this is one way, listeners, that in Congress that you can reconcile the differences between bills coming out of the House and the Senate or resolutions. So because you got to have identical bills passing both chambers before they can head to the White House. So one way that has become more increasingly common is for bills to bounce back and forth. A second way is to head what's called to a conference committee, and this is where you're going to have members of the House and the Senate. They're going to sit down. They're going to hash out the differences. But the big power of a conference committee is if they agree to something, it more or less gets an up-down vote in both chambers, no more changes. And so that gives Michael and I the chance to talk a little bit about, well, what is it now that's coming out of conference, right? So we have a much better idea of the tax bill than we have in the last few weeks when we've talked about it.
Yeah, definitely.
So here are some of the big things coming out, and then Michael, I think we can talk about this. And I think interestingly, well, we'll save that for just a second. What the big holdout had been Marco Rubio. Rubio basically at the end of this week said, I'm really uncomfortable with some of the things I'm seeing coming out of conference, and he wanted the child
Tax
child
credit,
tax
right?
credit. Thank you. To be increased. And the reason for that is one of the things that is we are now seeing coming out of the conference bill is that while the standard deduction is getting doubled, both for individuals and for couples married jointly, this is now going to be capped if you're married jointly as at $24,000, which is actually ironically less than it originally had been because it eliminates the personal exemptions, especially if you have kids, which could have taken you up to $29,600. So Rubio was saying, well, wait a second, we need to offset this somewhere else with the child tax credit. He is now on board. They have pushed that to 2,000, where 1,400 of it is refundable. And what that means, listeners, is that even if you had a $0 tax bill up to, depending on your other income circumstances, you could still get a $1,400 return because it's refundable whether or not you're paying. So those are some of the big kind of last minute changes we saw coming out of the conference committee. What do you think about what's been happening and the things that we now know about it, Michael?
Well, I think that was a good change, and I'm glad that that made it into it. There's overall, as I said when it went to conference, that I have real Well, I guess I see it as sort of two bills. On the corporate side, I think a lot of the changes were long overdue, and there are some pretty good. There are some good things in there. There are actually some things on the corporate side that I think could have gotten a certain amount of Democrat buy-in. That could have been the basis for at least an attempt at a bipartisan bill. On the individual side, I have huge problems with it for reasons I won't go into again. I think that certainly you can certainly justify changing our corporate tax system to bring it into line with what the corporate tax systems are for most of the other rich industrialized countries. That makes perfect sense to me. On the individual side, though, I think that's a real problem. I think it's just going to increase inequality. I think these are just really unjustifiable changes for the most part. They tend to favor the wealthiest people, and I think it's just going to make a number of bad situations worse. Also, the effect on the deficit, which apparently Republicans don't really care about. I thought Bob Corker cared about it, but now I guess he doesn't anymore. Suddenly he's I don't know. But that $1 trillion plus, someone's going to have to pay for that. And I don't know exactly how that's going to happen, but I think it's going to land on the middle class, and that's going to be too bad.
Well, I
I
mean, in
will
all
say,
honesty, Michael, I mean, I think it won't be the middle class. I think it's going to be my kids.
yeah, well, yeah, sure. A lot of people's kids at the future. Yeah, exactly. So middle class people in the future. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that are buried in this that I have a real problem with. One big thing that hasn't gotten a lot of attention that I wanted to bring up is the change in how tax brackets are adjusted for inflation. Now, most people don't
Interesting.
know this.
Yes.
This is, well, it's a really wonky sort of thing, right? Well, before 1986, tax reform, then tax brackets actually weren't adjusted for inflation, meaning that over time, as the cost of things got more expensive, people got more money, they'd move into a higher tax bracket. And that was kind of unfair. And so in the 86 reform, they changed that to index tax brackets to go up with the rate of inflation. Now, one of the things that's been done in this bill that is going to pass with almost no media fanfare is the measure of inflation is changing from what's called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, to something called the chained CPI, which is a less generous measure of inflation, basically. And what that means is you combine the fact that you change this measure of inflation for brackets, along with the fact that these individual cuts expire, is this bakes in kind of permanent tax increases for people. And these tax increases are going to affect people at the below the maximum bracket, that 37% bracket, I believe it is, the most, because of course those are the brackets that are going to go up and have the biggest effect. So in other words, this bill bakes in a permanent lower and middle class tax increase over time. And I think that should be a huge problem for a lot of folks, but apparently it's not.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because one of the things I wanted to talk about was that the seeming benefits that I was happy about are all going to be sunsetted in 2025
Yeah.
on the individual side, not on the corporate side. So again, I agree with you. I mean, I think we need to have corporate reform. We've already talked about that in the previous episode, the two of us, as a matter of fact. But because we have this 2025 with the chain CPI, you're not only going to have that creep, but imagine what's going to happen when you're now on the chain CPI and it reverts. Because I mean, it's very difficult to make prognostications that far in advance, make predictions that
Sure.
far in advance. But it seems very likely that Democrats are probably going to gain control of at least one of the chambers of government before 2025. And I don't think top on their list is going to be, redoing a redone tax plan. As much as they're fighting it now, they're going to have other priorities. And as a result, I think this is going to sunset. I don't think there's going to be the will to push it through, and so you're going to end up with kind of the worst of the previous plan with the worst of this plan.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I guess a larger point, I've made this point before, but I think it bears at least a little bit of repeating, is that what really disappoints me is I feel like there was an opportunity to at least try something that could have been bipartisan. I said before, on the left and the right, there's some pretty broad agreement that our corporate tax system is messed up. But again, the decision was made to kind of push this through. And Mitch McConnell himself, back when he was in the minority, said, we should never push through big legislation on a non-bipartisan level. If it's just one party, it's not going to have any legitimacy, and it's just not the way to govern. And all of a sudden, he gets in the majority and he changes his tune, and that's unfortunate because I agreed with Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, but Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is singing a different tune because, it's all become about just getting a win by any means necessary, and that just sucks.
Well, here's another question, Michael, and again, I mean, you can't speak for the Democratic Party in its entirety, but from my suggestion, it would be I can't imagine any kind of package in the current climate getting bipartisan support. And I don't mean that as a knock on Democrats, because I recognize, as you just rightfully pointed out, that that's exactly what Republicans have done. But if I'm the Democrats and I'm watching this series of Republican failures, there's no particularly good reason for me to want to cross the aisle on something even just like corporate tax reform, because then I'm not going to net the benefits from it with voters. And as a result, I mean, again, I would like to agree with you in principle on the, hey, we need to come together across bipartisan lines. But given the way that we see voting patterns occur, do you really think that Democrats could have afforded to have made that a bipartisan issue? And
Sure. Yeah. Not Chuck and Nancy, right? I mean, not the leadership. Definitely not for the reasons you point out. But I think that they could have picked off a few more conservative Democrats, because the issues that which Democrats are most likely to cross the aisle on are these sort of corporate economic issues. And so I think they could have picked off maybe 3 or 4, and then at least you could say, but again, so from the Republican calculus, you can give a big benefit to your donor class, or you can give a much smaller benefit to your donor class and get a gloss of bipartisanship. I mean, and you make that calculation, and I guess the decision is, well, it's a lot better to give a huge benefit to our donor class and just do it all on a party line vote. And
Well,
I understand what goes into that calculation, and I just am, it's just unfortunate that's the calculus.
Well, here's another. Let me, because I've been thinking about this carefully, and I can understand that perspective. Where look, it's the calculus is between the donor. But my question is, do you think it's really between the donor, or do you think it's the ability to try to bring on board members of the party who are further on the right to the spectrum? So, do you?
Yeah,
I have often
right.
wondered, is it really was the calculus here? Hey, I'm trying to give a bigger benefit to donor class, or was the bigger calculus here, I can pick up a few Democrats, but what happens if I lose? In other words, do I lose 10 Republicans
Yeah.
by picking up 3 Democrats? And I'm
No, yeah.
wondering if maybe that's not been the bigger, more pressing matter for leadership in both parties, right? So if I pick up those other guys, as you're right, kind of, I just try to get a few, get that gloss of bipartisanship.
Yeah.
How many of my own people do I lose? And if I lose more than I can pick up, well, then why bother to pick them up?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. I think it goes right along with that to make that calculation even more likely to go on along the lines of, well, let's just do this as a party line sort of thing, because there's this benefit as well. We make our lives easier, we please our donor class, we get this through. And so, yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. And again, this gets back to sort of a fundamental point I think that we've made again and again, that is important to make, is that when you take a look at why we get these legislative outcomes, it's not because Republicans are evil people who hate poor folks and want to see them die, in the gutter. It's because of these incentives that are built into the system that just make it so much easier to do things in a certain way, and that's true whether you're a Democrat or a Republican.
True, true. Well, I think we might need to move forward to our next story, which is the other big news well, is it really big news or just the continuation of news that Donald Trump is creepy? Uh, okay, I know I'm going to get lambasted on social media for that one, and I just don't care because he is. And this week, what brought this back to the fore was we had a joint interview between 3 accusers. And just keep in mind, these are 3 women who had already leveled these accusations against Donald Trump during the campaign. But this comes back to the fore when they went on Megyn Kelly's NBC show, which, and again, this is going to sound like a snipe, but it's just the case. Megyn Kelly is really happy about this because I think this is the first time anybody, in a positive way, has been mentioning Megyn Kelly's NBC show.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
just some disastrous interviews. Anyway, so this is our big news this week. These accusers are coming forward, but I think the other part of the big news that we're going to be hitting on is the way the White House and Donald Trump has responded to this and what's happened in the wake of it. First off, the White House says that these are, once again, quote, false claims, which are, quote, disputed in most cases by eyewitnesses, end quote. And they've already been addressed during the campaign, kind of a hard stop period. Then Trump gets on Twitter because he doesn't have enough to do in the early morning hours and says, quote, despite thousands of hours of wasted and many millions of dollars spent, the Democrats have been unable to show any collusion with Russia. So they are now moving on to the false accusations and fabricated stories of women who I don't know and or have never met. Fake news, he yells.
Yeah.
And then People Magazine kind of trolls him pretty hard as they then release a photo in their own tweet saying, oh, you've never met him. Well, here's all these pictures of you meeting one of the accusers. Oops.
Yeah.
Which
Uh-huh.
has led to lots of questions on the left, I think, way in advance, saying, well, is it time to impeach? NBC has an excellent article on this, by the way, so good job twice in a row, NBC. And I mean, the short answer is no. But the long answer is, what does this mean for the Trump administration? And what do you think about that, Michael?
Well, it's again, it's no surprise that Donald Trump is I don't think it's any news that Donald Trump is sort of a sexual predator. I think that people have known that for a long time, and a lot of people just decide.
The
I wouldn't
fake
say they
news
don't.
knows it. I don't know about the rest of them.
Yeah, that's true. I think a lot of people just decided, just like a lot of liberals decided about Bill Clinton, that his stances on other things he wants to do, are more important than that outweigh that, the good that he could do, that sort of thing. And I think that's a very self-serving sort of rationalization. I don't agree with it. I think that just based on sort of moral grounds, Donald Trump is unfit to be president of the United States. I've made that argument before, and but it doesn't surprise me because this is straight out of the Donald Trump playbook. It's pretty clear that Donald Trump does not ever admit guilt, never steps back. It's just attack, 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 and so he's locked into that. That's what he does. That's who he is, for better or for worse. I would argue mostly for worse. And I don't think this will end up being an impeachable type of thing. It means he's a crummy human being, but hey, I already knew that, as did a lot of other people. I guess to me, the more important thing is, or I don't know more important is the right word, but what interests me more is how both parties are handling this larger scandal, this larger awakening of the public to this issue. And Republicans are really in a tough position because the leader of their party is a sexual predator. That's a real problem. You can only do so much when the leader of your party is sort of that sort of person. Democrats have gone the other way, have adopted essentially a zero tolerance policy. I mean, Nancy Pelosi called for the resignation of Ruben Kihuen, who, there are some allegations against him, and she called for the resignation of Conyers, and they called for the resignation of Franken and so forth. Now, I think you can make an argument that, well, you can be concerned that maybe this goes a little bit too far the other way, and then to what extent do you need multiple claims before you should just say, well, you should just resign because somebody alleges something? I'm a little bit sympathetic to that, but I think certainly this is an issue that benefits Democrats a lot more. It's a lot easier for Democrats to embrace this issue because Democrats do tend to be a party that sticks up more for, at least, certainly in their rhetoric, promotes women, victims, that sort of thing. And so I think that works better for what Democrats already tend to believe in. For Republicans, it's a lot harder issue. And I think this is another thing that at least I hope will help to increase, energize turnout in the 2018 elections, especially among women, and maybe make some sort of a difference. Although if Alabama is any sort of model of that, I don't know how successful that's going to be, but we'll see.
Well, and this is interesting because here another time, and we can maybe get a little more wonky on this, Michael, is that one of the things that we've known for decades in political science, I mean, repeated over and over again, these kinds of issues, and hear what I'm saying, I'm not saying they're not important. They're simply not the things that people vote on.
Right.
Party affiliation remains, I mean, anybody who even says, I kind of sort of lean one direction that is the biggest predictor of vote over anything that happens. I mean, so much so that there's decades where we can't even uncover that campaigns have any effect on who wins or loses because these long-term structural variables end up being the general things that we can identify in a big way. And I think that's kind of hard sometimes, when you're listening to a story like this, where there are lots of these kind of moral allegations at play. But then, as you rightfully point out, take a look at Alabama, take a look at the numbers we were just talking about. Bigger
Yeah, and I think,
variables generally play out, not these kinds of things in elections. And then again, I want everybody to hear me rightly. I'm not saying that that's my moral stance. I'm just making an empirical
right.
statement of what we see in political science, having studied lots and lots of voters.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And again, I think it can be hard for people to say, to see these things and say, how could this not affect your opinion? How could you not be outraged? But the fact that we, more and more increasingly live in these partisan echo chambers, it's really easy. It's easier now than ever to dismiss this stuff or discount this stuff.
Well,
And
or to
so,
never even get it. I think that's one of the other
yeah,
things that we forget. Before the show was going on, the two of us, we were talking about how we're kind of techie guys, right? We care a lot about the equipment that we use, and then we have to realize that not everybody's that way. And I think the same thing holds true here. if I'm gonna buy a cell phone, this or a laptop, this is a big deal for me, right? This is a huge. I know all of the elements of it, but for the
Right.
average voter and for the average consumer, they're not doing that. So they're not picking between an Apple and a Lenovo laptop because they've taken a look at the stats and the ports and the how much hard drive. No, they're doing it based on these other structural variables and I think so when we talk about this, keep in mind we're not just saying this is what people do, they're weird or they're irrational when it comes to politics. This is how humans behave. This is the default position.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent point. Excellent point. So yeah, I expect, as I said with Jay before, I expect to see more allegations, more resignations, and this certainly has not by any means ended. And I just hope that Congress actually takes some concrete steps to change their systems so that it's not as arduous, as difficult for people who have been the victims of sexual abuse to at least make a claim and work through a process. And we'll see how that turns out.
Exactly. Well, I think we were going to turn to Mueller next, and you had some things you wanted to talk about, Michael.
Well, yeah, of course. A lot of the media, especially conservative media, is the person of the week, I guess, is Peter Strzok, and Peter Strzok being that senior FBI counterintelligence agent who exchanged these series of text messages with FBI lawyer Lisa Page. Many of them basically suggesting that Donald Trump was perhaps the worst person in the world and should never be president. We had to do something, and that sort of thing. And Strzok, of course, also was involved with the Hillary Clinton email investigation, and in one of the draft reports changed some language that made it sound like her Clinton's complicity was less, and that sort of thing. And so what this has all led to is a lot of people, not just the Breitbart crew, but in a lot of mainstream conservative calling for an investigation of the investigators, basically suggesting that Robert Mueller's team, not just because of Strzok, who was actually taken off the case when Mueller found out about these messages, but that essentially Robert Mueller cannot be unbiased, that this investigation is entirely tainted, and therefore it's just meaningless, and it should either be people should be fired or it should be shut down, and that sort of thing. And so, I have a lot of problems with this, obviously, and I got to say, the main problem I have with this, Trey, is Republicans or the people who are questioning the integrity of this investigation. They're not just questioning the integrity of Strzok. They're questioning the integrity of Robert Mueller, who, 7 months ago, just to remind people, when he was appointed, was seen by liberals and conservatives as a great choice. Newt Gingrich called him a wonderful choice, a serious person with tons of integrity. It's also questioning the integrity of Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who, again, he's a Donald Trump appointee. And when he was appointed and confirmed, he was hailed as a smart, fair person, confirmed, by the way, 94-6, with every Republican senator voting for him. So the question I want to ask people is, what's more likely? That Mueller and Rosenstein suddenly, in the course of 7 months, became stupid, biased political hacks, or maybe that this is being used as a pretext to discredit an investigation. To me, those are the two alternatives, essentially, and I don't know which way I come down on that.
Well, and even beyond the actuality of what's happening, late this weekend, the last Harvard poll suggested that 54% of voters think that Mueller is biased.
Yeah,
So I mean,
absolutely. And I think that's another point I want to bring in. Sorry, is that there's this disconnect. Almost everyone has a political opinion. You can't be in government service and not have preferences. I mean, if you're involved in politics in any way, you're going to, think, well, I would prefer that Donald Trump is president over Hillary Clinton, or Jeb Bush over Donald Trump, or whatever, right? The disconnect here is that everyone, or not everyone, but an increasing number of Americans now assume that if you have a political preference, an ideological preference, you will not be able to put that aside and act with integrity and honor. And that to me is just is the most awful thing, because I honestly believe that, yes, Robert Mueller does have preferences. And I bet you his preference for president wouldn't have been Donald Trump, just like almost all of the entire Republican establishment didn't want Donald Trump to be president, right? But that doesn't mean that he can't put that aside and be fair. And to me, the idea that our government officials can't do that, most of them can and do that every single day. And if we call that into question, then we essentially can't have legitimate government.
No, it's it's a difficult question, Michael, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I know I'm a little worked up about this, but to me, this strikes at the core of democracy. The belief that the people who are working for us can be fair and decent and just individuals. And to me, again, I'll get a little partisan here, but I guess that's going to be okay, I hope. But if you look back decades to the early 1990s, Newt Gingrich was kind of the ringleader of this, who decided that, it's been long enough that we have been in the wilderness in Congress. We need to do something to change things. And well, what we're going to do to gain the majority is we are going to basically destroy the credibility of Congress as an institution and kind of come on in on a big anti-government sort of platform. And that worked brilliantly. But the problem with that is that idea of we have to destroy this village to save the village is that, well, you've got a destroyed village. And so you occupy this territory, but then what do you have left? You have rubble left. And that to me has been the depressing, dispiriting result of decades of concerted attempt to discredit government in every single way, is that now people can't believe anyone, and there's almost no legitimacy, and just disgusting.
I'm totally on board with the Mueller. Although I might have a little pushback with the Gingrich. Not that I don't think he did that, but if you take a look at the trends of the approval ratings of Congress, they were tanking. I would suggest that Republicans caught on to a trend that was occurring and positioned themselves around the trend rather than were the variable that drove the trend. But just
that's a really good point. I think they latched onto something that was very effective, and so yeah. And I don't mean to say, let me back up a little bit. I don't mean to say that I think that Newt Gingrich and this evil cabal of Republicans had this plot to destroy the country, and they saw this would be an awesome thing. I think honestly that it was sort of these Democrats are leading us down a path that is just disastrous, and the end justifies the means here. And if we have to destroy the credibility of government in the short term to gain power to do good things, well, we'll do that. That's the oldest story in the book. We'll sacrifice a little bit of our morals, of our integrity to get into power so we can do good things. And that oftentimes doesn't end too well. And I think that's kind of the case here. But anyway, another thing I wanted to point out is I think this also brings up a sort of a more fundamental problem with the broad scope of this investigation. And I would argue that this goes back to the nature of the mandate that was given to Mueller by Rod Rosenstein. If you take a look at the letter that appointed him back in May, I mean, it was a pretty broad scope. Now, they certainly could have written that to be a little narrower. I'm not sure why he decided to make it as broad as it was, but I'm sure he had his reasons.
It's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that.
Well, and another thing I think is, this idea that, well, we should have just a special counsel to investigate the special counsel. That just multiplies the disastrousness of this. And, one possible way to handle these things that might have been better would have been for Congress to create a special or select committee, they called it, to have an investigation. And Congress has the ability to do this for certain special things like this. There was nothing that would have prevented Congress, for instance, from designing a committee that would have equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans, and maybe picking people who have reputations for being sober, responsible people, as opposed to kind of partisan, headline grabbers and bomb throwers, that sort of thing. Congress chose not to do that. Okay, fine. But and so we have a case where now, sort of the government or the executive branch is kind of examining itself, and there are some obvious conflicts there. And so, I think this is the largest problem here, right? Is this hyper-partisan environment? I think, and that I don't know that there's a real good institutional short-term fix for that.
Well, that's interesting, Michael. But we probably need to now move forward to kind of the last segment of the show and talk a little bit about what we're reading. And I've got two things on deck, but how about you go first? Because I think you get an interesting one.
Well, yeah, it's an article from National Review, which is conservative publication, but it's a lot of good stuff. I think it's called "Can NFL Football Survive the Brain Injury Epidemic?" And I thought it's really interesting because, well, number one, I'm a huge and very conflicted fan of the NFL, and my team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, have been in the news. Mainly when one of their players actually suffered a very traumatic spinal injury, and we don't know if he'll ever be able to play football again. Thankfully, he should be able to recover enough to live a normal life and walk and all that. But this kind of thing, along with all of the evidence that we have about brain injury and so forth. Yeah, I guess my concern is it should we be watching football? Should we be promoting this sort of thing, or what can be done? Does government have a role in maybe helping to make government or helping to make football more safe? And I would argue that, yeah, government could certainly take a role. And then this doesn't get covered in the article, but hopefully something I plan on writing a blog post about is that the NFL, just like all sports leagues, get special treatment in form of antitrust exemption, so forth, which is how they can do a draft and other things like that. And certainly if Congress wanted to, if it was enough of an issue, they could put pressure on the NFL, some very strong pressure, to reform itself in a way that I think would allow football to continue, but would make the game a lot safer for people. And in fact, something like that actually happened way back in the day, around a century ago, at the behest of my favorite president of all time, Theodore Roosevelt, who pushed for some changes to the game that eliminated things like the flying wedge, which was an insane thing that people would die. I mean,
I was going to
so
say, yeah, I mean, in that era, there was lots of deaths in football.
yeah, so I mean, so I think something can be done. I think just regardless if you're a fan at all of football, I think it's a really interesting thing to read, and so I would suggest people take a look at it, and the link is up there. And one more thing I should point out, another just quick thing I wanted to plug is my blog this week. Another thing I hope people take a look at is I did a post on the politics of better beer. And so if you're a beer fan, actually that involves, believe it or not, Trey, the current tax bill. There are some set asides put in there, some tax breaks put in there for craft brewers and just general big brewers and so forth. And I talked a little bit about in the article about how Congress basically sort of helped make the craft beer revolution possible. And so if you're interested in that at all, you can find it at politicsguys.com/Mike and then check it out and let me know what you think. So that's what I got for this week.
Well, I will definitely be reading that. And were you drinking a good German Hefeweizen while you were writing it?
Sadly, no, but that would have been fitting. Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
I just wonder, on my side, I actually have two books to recommend that I just got finished. I should say devouring. I just didn't read them. I devoured them. A good friend and colleague of mine, Jessica Kessler, here at Daytona State, was taking a look at a book and asking me some questions about it. It's called American Girls: Social Media and the Secret Lives of Teenagers, and it's by Nancy Jo Sales. And she is actually a reporter who had been doing this long form story on the ways that social media interact with teenagers. And then, but she started to notice patterns for girls. And it was fascinating. So I actually went out, grabbed the book, and I read it in about 2 days. And I think most listeners, I think you guys would too. Forewarning, it can be a little repetitive in spots. And as a social scientist, I wish that she at least tried to have some more empirical rather than just pure interview data. But her take on, again, this is something that I study, and I did not realize the extent to the ways that social media have reshaped the way girls have to navigate communication. The prevalence of penis pictures, or as they call them, dick pics, as a form of like saying, "Hey, I like you," is
Jeez.
just stunning. As a matter of fact, Michael, almost all girls, about 96% of them, will see one of those before they're a teenager.
Wow,
Yes,
that's scary.
and the number of hours. And so it was funny. So I'd gotten done with that, and I took it back. And there at the library was another book I'd been interested in. It just came out called Screen Schooled, and it's by Joe Clement and Matt Miles. And they're talking about this very same thing that Nancy Joe was, but they're talking about it from the point of view as educators. Both of them are teachers in the school system. And again, my eyes were open. I had no idea the number of minutes that students known to their teachers are spending online in school. As a matter of fact, many of these tens of thousands of text messages and Instagrams and other forms that people have never heard of before in class. And they're making a case. They're actually making an empirical case. Nancy Joe is just explaining something. But Clement and Miles are actually arguing that we need to redo schools in a way that decreases the amount of screen time. And specifically, when we look at it, they're not talking about screen time in general, but more screen time when it's connected to the internet. And
Yeah.
so, very fascinating reads. If anybody wants to take a look at this, again, coming from a guy who's a tech guy, it was fascinating and a little disconcerting as a parent of three and a little girl to think about how do I help them navigate this space. So I would
Yeah.
highly, highly encourage everybody, if you're interested in this, you fall in those categories, to read American Girls in Screen School.
That sounds great. All right. And as usual, links to all of these will be up there in the show notes on the site. So, all right. Well, I guess that about does it for today's episode. Thanks.
Yes, it
Yeah,
does.
well, thanks everyone for listening. We really hope you like what you heard and that you will check out today's sponsor, Dollar Shave Club, where new members get Dollar Shave Club starter set featuring their executive razor, a full set of cartridges, shave butter, body wash, and One Wipe Charlie's butt wipes for only $5 by going to dollarshaveclub.com/TPG. Listener support is really important to us. And if you'd like to help us out, go to politicsguys.com and click on either the PayPal or Patreon link to make a one-time or regular contribution. Oh, one thing, before we go, Trey, I should point out, last week we talked about Patreon changing their fee structure and so forth to put more of the cost on sponsors or supporters as opposed to on us. Patreon actually changed that. They heard what people said, people's protests. I think that's great. And so if you want to support us through Patreon, you won't be charged more fees now because Patreon wisely, I think, revised that policy that hadn't gone into effect yet. So yay, Patreon, for doing the right thing by supporters. I think that's great. Anyway, if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can share this episode with your friends and followers or pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. And of course, leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also really does help out. If you want to get in touch with us, we're at mail@politicsguys.com, and there's our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Trey Orndorff. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.